At 17 years old, Gabaldon made the decision to enlist in the United States Marine Corps. His motivations formed a complicated tapestry woven from patriotism, a desire to prove his loyalty to a country that had just imprisoned his adoptive family, and a recognition that his unique language skills might prove valuable in the war against Japan. His Japanese wasn't perfect by any means. He hadn't studied it in a formal academic setting with grammar books and vocabulary lists. Instead, his command of the language came from dinner-table conversations, from daily interactions, from the organic process of living within a bilingual household. This conversational fluency, learned in the context of real human relationships rather than military necessity, would prove to be precisely what made his approach effective in ways that formally trained interpreters could never match. By March of 1944, Private Gabaldon found himself assigned to Headquarters and Service Company of the 2nd Marines, 2nd Marine Division, in a role designated as Scout and Observer. This position theoretically allowed for the utilization of his language capabilities, though no one in the command structure quite knew what to make of this small Mexican-American Marine who claimed to speak Japanese. His unit began preparing for Operation Forager, the planned invasion of the Mariana Islands, where American military intelligence estimated that approximately 30,000 Japanese troops awaited, along with an unknown number of Japanese civilians whose presence on the island would complicate the already brutal mathematics of combat. The intelligence reports painted a deeply troubling picture of what American forces would face. Japanese military authorities on Saipan had distributed hand grenades to civilian families with instructions on how to use them against American soldiers. Children had been taught that attacking Americans was their duty to the Emperor. Mothers had been told that Marines were recruited from American prisons, that these men were criminals and rapists who would show no mercy to captured civilians. The propaganda distributed among the civilian population depicted Americans as literal demons, as monsters who would rape women and cannibalize children. This wasn't subtle propaganda. This was systematic conditioning designed to ensure that civilians would prefer death to capture, that they would fight to the last person rather than surrender. The stage was being set for a catastrophic civilian death toll, and American commanders preparing for the invasion understood that they would be fighting not just Japanese military forces, but also dealing with a civilian population that had been psychologically prepared to choose mass suicide over surrender. On June 15, 1944, Gabaldon waded ashore at Saipan as part of the massive American invasion force. The battle that followed would continue until July 9th, lasting nearly a month of brutal fighting that would push Japanese military forces and civilians steadily northward on the island. What set Gabaldon apart from the thousands of other Marines fighting on Saipan wasn't his marksmanship or his combat effectiveness. He was, by all accounts, an average Marine in those respects. What distinguished him was his willingness to engage in completely unauthorized nighttime missions that violated every protocol in the Marine Corps manual. According to his Navy Cross citation and official Marine Corps records, Gabaldon began slipping away from his unit at night, moving alone through terrain where Japanese soldiers waited in caves and bunkers, approaching enemy positions without backup or support. His methodology bore no resemblance to standard military procedure. He would locate caves or bunkers where Japanese soldiers and civilians had taken shelter, then position himself outside these defensive positions and begin calling out in Japanese. He announced that he was alone and unarmed, that he meant no harm, that prisoners were being treated well by American forces. He would describe the food that prisoners received, talk about safety and medical care, speak about the treatment that surrendered Japanese were actually experiencing rather than what propaganda had told them to expect. This approach required extraordinary patience. His first success came early in the Saipan campaign, when he spent hours sitting outside a cave, speaking conversationally in Japanese about mundane topics, about food and weather and safety, gradually building trust until several Japanese soldiers emerged and surrendered. Word of these successes spread through his unit, though his commanding officers initially regarded his methods with deep skepticism. The Marine Corps had trained interpreters who used bullhorns to broadcast surrender demands in formal military Japanese, following established procedures for psychological operations. Gabaldon's approach differed fundamentally from this standard methodology. He spoke colloquially rather than formally, using the casual language patterns and cultural references he had absorbed from the Nakanos. He employed concepts of honor and respect that demonstrated genuine cultural knowledge rather than military phrasebook learning. He offered dignity in surrender rather than demanding unconditional capitulation. He framed surrender not as defeat, but as a means to protect families, to survive for Japan's future reconstruction, to fulfill obligations to loved ones by staying alive. The climactic moment of Gabaldon's War arrived on July 8, 1944, by which date American forces had pushed the remaining Japanese military forces and the civilian population into the northern portion of Saipan. The situation had become desperate beyond description. Mass civilian suicides had already begun at locations that would become known to history as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, where hundreds of Japanese civilians, completely convinced by propaganda that American capture meant torture and death, were throwing themselves and their children off cliffs into the ocean below. Mothers were killing their children before killing themselves. Entire families were detonating grenades together. The scenes of mass civilian death traumatized American forces who witnessed them, many of whom had never imagined they would watch civilians choose death over surrender. According to documentation from the National Museum of the Marine Corps and Gabaldon's official Navy Cross citation, on this 8th day of July, Gabaldon approached a large concentration of Japanese forces and civilians sheltering in caves and bunkers in northern Saipan. The exact location of these caves and the specific content of his conversations were never documented in primary sources, which would later fuel skepticism about his claims. However, the outcome is verified by multiple sources. Gabaldon returned to American lines that day, accompanied by 807 prisoners, a mixture of Japanese soldiers and civilians who had chosen to trust this small Marine speaking their language rather than believe the propaganda that had told them Americans were monsters. This single day's achievement represents one of the largest surrenders to an individual soldier in the entire history of the United States military. Marine Corps intelligence officers, including men whose names would later appear in various accounts and verifications, Colonel Walter Lehrer, Colonel John Schwaber, and Major James High, would subsequently verify these numbers in public forums, most notably during a 1957 episode of the television program This Is Your Life. The extraordinary nature of what Gabaldon had accomplished led to both official recognition and persistent skepticism that would follow him for the rest of his life. Just days after the mass surrender, on July 15, 1944, Captain John Schwaber submitted a recommendation that Gabaldon be awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration for valor. This recommendation worked its way up the chain of command until it reached General Holland Smith, the commanding general of the expeditionary troops, who made the decision to downgrade the recommendation. The citation that eventually accompanied Gabaldon's Navy Cross conveys the scope of his achievements while simultaneously raising questions about verification. The official language describes how, working alone in front lines, Private First Class Gabaldon daringly entered enemy caves, pillboxes, buildings, and jungle brush, frequently facing hostile fire, succeeding in obtaining vital military intelligence while capturing well over 1,000 enemy civilians and troops. This official recognition from the United States Marine Corps validates the essential truth of his accomplishments, yet the phrase "well over 1,000" provides enough ambiguity that debates about exact numbers would continue for decades. Not everyone accepted Gabaldon's account without reservation. Lieutenant Robert B. Sheeks, a Marine Japanese language officer who served on Saipan, later expressed skepticism about some of Gabaldon's claims, characterizing him as a relentless self-promoter. This criticism highlights one of the fundamental difficulties in evaluating Gabaldon's achievements. His operations occurred at night, alone, without witnesses who could independently verify the details of what transpired. He operated outside the normal chain of command, conducting missions that hadn't been authorized by his superiors. The circumstances that made his approach effective, the solitary nighttime operations, the patient hours of conversation, the cultural bridge building that occurred in darkness, also made independent verification difficult or impossible. Understanding the significance of Gabaldon's successes requires placing them within the brutal context of the overall battle for Saipan. This island witnessed some of the Pacific War's most savage fighting. American forces suffered over 3,000 deaths and 10,000 wounded. The Japanese garrison of approximately 30,000 soldiers was virtually annihilated, with fewer than 1,000 surviving. Most tragically, an estimated 22,000 Japanese civilians died during the battle, with thousands choosing suicide over capture. The mass civilian suicides shocked American forces who witnessed them. The sight of mothers throwing their children from cliffs before jumping themselves, of entire families detonating grenades together, of systematic self-destruction driven by propaganda-induced terror, left psychological scars on many American servicemen who had never anticipated that their enemy would include civilians who preferred death to the mere possibility of capture. Against this backdrop of almost incomprehensible civilian tragedy, Gabaldon's ability to convince any Japanese to surrender takes on profound significance. His success suggests that cultural knowledge and linguistic ability could overcome even the most intense and sustained propaganda efforts. Every person he convinced to surrender represented one fewer casualty subtracted from the terrible statistics of the Saipan battle. Every life saved was a family that remained intact, a child who grew up with parents, a community that retained its members. The ripple effects of these saved lives would extend through generations. Late in the Saipan campaign, Gabaldon was wounded by machine gun fire while conducting one of his unauthorized solo missions. His Navy Cross citation notes these wounds without specifying the exact date or location of the incident. Despite his injuries, he continued his operations until he was eventually evacuated for medical treatment. After recovering from his wounds, Gabaldon returned to duty and participated in additional Pacific operations, though none would match the scale or significance of his achievements on Saipan. His total captures for the entire war are officially listed as well over 1,000 enemy civilians and troops, with most sources citing approximately 1,500 total captures across all his operations. Gabaldon initially received the Silver Star, the military's third highest decoration for valor, for his actions on Saipan. This recognition stood until November 23, 1960, when the award was upgraded to the Navy Cross, making it the highest decoration awarded to any Marine of Mexican descent during World War II. The Navy Cross ranks as the Navy and Marine Corps' second highest decoration for valor, exceeded only by the Medal of Honor. Multiple campaigns have been launched over the decades seeking to upgrade Gabaldon's Navy Cross to the Medal of Honor. Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, the Hispanic Medal of Honor Society, and various congressional representatives have led these efforts at different times. All such efforts have been officially rejected, with the stated reasons involving time limitations on reconsidering military awards, though some observers suggest that institutional reluctance to recognize unconventional warfare methods may also play a role. The controversy extends well beyond questions of medals and recognition. Some historians have questioned whether one man could realistically have achieved the numbers attributed to Gabaldon. Others point out that his methods of operating alone at night without witnesses make thorough verification fundamentally difficult. Yet Marine Corps intelligence officers did officially verify his achievements, and his Navy Cross citation represents formal military recognition of his accomplishments at the highest levels of the service. The verified core of his story, documented in official military records and confirmed by intelligence officers, remains remarkable, even accounting for the impossibility of verifying every specific detail of operations that occurred alone in darkness more than 80 years ago. In 1960, Hollywood released a film titled Hell to Eternity, allegedly based on Gabaldon's wartime experiences. The film cast Jeffrey Hunter, a 6-foot-tall, blue-eyed actor, in the role of Gabaldon, effectively erasing his Mexican-American identity from the story. The movie transformed his patient negotiations and cultural bridge-building into standard action hero dramatics, his nuanced understanding of Japanese culture into American swagger and bravado. Gabaldon himself reportedly expressed disappointment with the film, which took considerable liberties with the actual events of his life. The Hollywood version emphasized combat over communication, violence over patience, turning what was essentially a story about cultural understanding and human connection into a conventional war movie that bore little resemblance to what actually happened. The film's distortions would shape public perception of Gabaldon's achievements for decades, with many people's only exposure to his story coming through this heavily fictionalized and whitewashed version. In 1990, Gabaldon published his autobiography titled Saipan, Suicide Island, which was later republished under the title America Betrayed. The book provides his personal account of his wartime experiences, though historians note that memoirs written decades after events must always be evaluated carefully, as memory can shift and change over time, details can blur, and the natural human tendency towards self-justification can shape narratives. In his book, Gabaldon emphasized that his success came from treating Japanese soldiers and civilians as human beings rather than as enemies, from understanding their culture rather than just memorizing phrases in their language, from exercising patience rather than applying force. He described sitting for hours outside caves, talking about food and family and safety, about life and hope and the future, until fear gradually gave way to trust, and people who had been convinced they would be tortured and killed if they surrendered, instead chose to believe one young Marine who spoke their language with genuine understanding. After the war ended, Gabaldon returned to civilian life in the United States, though he would eventually make a surprising decision to settle on Saipan itself for 20 years, where he started a fishing business. He married and had 11 children, 9 of whom survived to adulthood. He spent decades of his post-war life speaking at schools and military events and community gatherings about his experiences, consistently emphasizing the importance of cultural understanding and the value of treating enemies as human beings. On July 7, 2006, Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa honored Gabaldon at City Hall, formally recognizing his contributions to American military history. Just weeks after this recognition, on August 31, 2006, Gabaldon died of heart disease in Old Town, Florida, at the age of 80. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, the nation's most prestigious military cemetery, where his grave has become a site of pilgrimage for those interested in Hispanic military history and the study of unconventional warfare. The story of the Nakano family, the Japanese-American family that took in young Guy Gabaldon and taught him their language and culture, includes another remarkable chapter that intersects with one of the most celebrated units in American military history. Lane Nakano, one of Gabaldon's adoptive brothers from the family that had been sent to Hart Mountain internment camp, served with the legendary 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a unit composed almost entirely of Japanese-American soldiers. The 442nd became the most decorated unit in United States military history for its size and length of service, earning an astounding 94 186 Purple Hearts and 21 Medals of Honor through their service primarily in the European theatre. The parallel service of Gabaldon and Lane Nakano represents one of the most unique and poignant chapters in American military history. One man used Japanese language skills to save Japanese lives in the Pacific, while the other proved Japanese-American loyalty through combat in Europe, and both served with extraordinary distinction while their Japanese-American family remained confined behind barbed wire in an internment camp in Wyoming. Lane Nakano survived the war and lived until April 28, 2005, maintaining contact with Gabaldon throughout their lives. Their shared story illustrates the profound complexity of World War II, where racial prejudice at home coexisted with heroism abroad. where a nation that imprisoned people because of their ancestry simultaneously relied on members of that same ancestry to fight its wars. The Nakano family's experience encapsulates this contradiction, watching from behind barbed wire as their adoptive son fought in the Pacific and their biological son fought in Europe, both proving their loyalty to a country that had stripped their family of freedom and property. While the specific influence of Gabaldon's methods on subsequent military doctrine is difficult to document with precision, military sources note that his efforts have become standard teaching examples for United States military psychological operations personnel. His demonstration that cultural knowledge could achieve tactical success influenced thinking about language training and cultural preparation for military personnel in ways that are still being felt today. The Marine Corps has incorporated lessons from Gabaldon's experience into various training programs, though specific manuals or policies directly citing his influence remain classified or are not publicly available. His example is regularly used to illustrate the value of language skills and cultural understanding in military operations, particularly in training scenarios involving civilian populations in combat zones. Modern military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan have demonstrated the continued relevance of Gabaldon's approach in contemporary conflicts. Military units with embedded interpreters who understand not just language but culture have consistently reported better outcomes in civilian interactions, more effective intelligence gathering, and reduced civilian casualties. The principle that Gabaldon demonstrated intuitively in 1944, that understanding enemy culture can be as valuable as firepower in achieving military objectives, remains valid in 21st century conflicts, where the lines between combatants and civilians blur, and where winning hearts and minds can prove as important as winning firefights. Historians who have evaluated Gabaldon's achievements place them within the broader context of the Pacific War and the unique challenges of fighting an enemy that had been conditioned to fight to the death. The Battle for Saipan ranked as one of the war's bloodiest engagements, with casualty rates exceeding 90% for Japanese military forces. Against this backdrop of near-total annihilation, Gabaldon's ability to convince any Japanese personnel to surrender was extraordinary. But his to do so in such large numbers defied all expectations and challenged conventional wisdom about the impossibility of Japanese surrender. Dr. Gordon W. Pranger, the noted Pacific War historian whose work has become foundational to understanding the conflict, included Gabaldon's story in his studies of individual heroism during World War II. While noting the inherent difficulty in verifying specific details of Gabaldon's claims given the nature of his operations, Prange acknowledged that the Marine Corps' official recognition through the Navy Cross validates the essential truth of his achievements. The challenge in assessing Gabaldon's legacy lies in the need to separate verified facts from embellishments that may have accumulated over time. The core achievement of capturing approximately 1,500 Japanese soldiers and civilians through persuasion rather than force is documented in official military records and verified by intelligence officers. The specific details of how he accomplished this, the exact conversations that occurred, the precise methods he used in individual instances remained less clear and may be unknowable given that these events occurred alone in darkness more than 8 decades ago. The documented statistics of Gabaldon's military service tell their own story without need for embellishment. Verified captures number well over 1,000 according to his Navy Cross citation, approximately 1,500 according to official Marine Corps records. He held the final rank of Private First Class, having been promoted during his service. His primary decoration was the Navy Cross, awarded November 23, 1960. His secondary decoration was the Silver Star, later upgraded to the Navy Cross. He received the Purple Heart for wounds received in action on Saipan. These numbers and decorations, while impressive in their own right, only hint at the human dimension of Gabaldon's achievements. Each capture represented not just a statistic, but a life saved, a Japanese soldier or civilian who survived the war because one Marine chose persuasion over violence, understanding over hatred. The decision to surrender often came at enormous personal cost for Japanese soldiers and civilians who had been taught that surrender meant the ultimate dishonor. Gabaldon's success in convincing them to take this step demonstrates principles that are now recognized in psychological operations and cultural warfare doctrine. His approach incorporated several key elements that military analysts have since identified as crucial to his effectiveness. First, he operated from a position of apparent vulnerability, approaching alone, announcing himself, claiming to be unarmed. These actions fundamentally contradicted the Japanese propaganda narrative about American brutality and aggressiveness. His small physical stature, standing 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing 123 pounds, made him less physically threatening than the demon-like Americans described in Japanese propaganda materials. His very appearance challenged the propaganda narrative before he even began speaking. Second, he used familiar language patterns rather than formal military Japanese. He didn't speak like a military interpreter using a phrasebook. He spoke like someone who had learned Japanese by living with a Japanese family, using the conversational patterns and casual expressions of daily life. This familiarity suggested genuine cultural knowledge rather than surface-level military training, and this distinction proved crucial in building trust. Third, he demonstrated extraordinary patience that contradicted every stereotype about impatient, aggressive Americans. Military records indicate that he would spend hours outside caves, talking continuously, repeating assurances, allowing fear to subside gradually rather than demanding immediate surrender. This patience allowed time for doubt to creep into the propaganda narrative, for people to begin questioning what they had been told about American intentions. Fourth, he offered dignity in surrender by framing it not as shameful capitulation, but as a means to protect families, to survive for Japan's future reconstruction, to fulfill obligations to loved ones by staying alive. This reframing provided psychological space for surrender without requiring complete loss of honor, which would have been psychologically impossible for many Japanese soldiers and civilians to accept. To fully understand the magnitude of Gabaldon's achievement, one must understand the intensity and pervasiveness of Japanese propaganda on Saipan. Military authorities had systematically told civilians that Americans would torture all captured men without exception, rape all women regardless of age, and literally eat children. This wasn't metaphorical language about destruction. Propaganda materials explicitly depicted Americans as cannibals who would consume human flesh. The propaganda further claimed that Americans would desecrate Japanese bodies, destroy Japanese culture and traditions, eliminate the Japanese language, and erase all traces of Japanese civilization. This propaganda was constantly reinforced by military police who physically forced civilians toward cliffs when American forces approached, by officers who distributed grenades to families with explicit instructions to use them for suicide rather than surrender, by relentless repetition through every available channel that death was infinitely preferable to capture. Civilian suicides were framed as martyrdom for the emperor, as noble sacrifices that would inspire future generations, as the highest expression of Japanese virtue. Against this wall of systematic, sustained propaganda delivered through multiple channels and reinforced by military authority, Gabaldon's ability to convince anyone to surrender seems almost impossible to comprehend. Yet he succeeded, not once or twice, but repeatedly, through patient demonstration that the propaganda was false. His very presence as a small young Marine speaking Japanese, approaching alone and apparently unarmed, contradicted everything civilians had been told about Americans. Every peaceful interaction further undermined the propaganda narrative. Every assurance that proved true chipped away at the foundation of fear and hatred that Japanese military authorities had constructed. Every person who surrendered and received food and medical care rather than torture became living proof that the propaganda was lies. Gabaldon's experience offers lessons that remain relevant in contemporary conflicts where civilian populations are caught between combatants and where propaganda shapes perceptions more than reality. In such conflicts, which have characterized warfare from Vietnam through Iraq and Afghanistan to present-day situations, cultural understanding can prevent casualties more effectively than firepower. His methods suggest several enduring principles that transcend the specific circumstances of Saipan in 1944. Language skills must include cultural knowledge to be truly effective. Memorizing phrases isn't enough. Understanding the cultural context in which those phrases are used, the social dynamics they reflect, the values they embody, proves essential. Individual initiative can sometimes achieve results that formal military operations cannot match. Large-scale operations with overwhelming force may be necessary for conventional objectives, but they can actually impede efforts to build trust with civilian populations. Patience and respect can overcome even the most intense propaganda when given sufficient time and opportunity. Treating enemies as potential future allies rather than permanent adversaries creates unexpected opportunities for peaceful resolution. Small unit or individual operations can sometimes succeed where large-scale operations fail by avoiding the intimidation factor of massive military force. These lessons have been applied with varying degrees of success in recent conflicts. In Iraq and Afghanistan, military units that invested substantially in cultural training and language skills reported significantly better outcomes in civilian interactions, more effective intelligence gathering, and reduced civilian casualties. However, the systematic application of Gabaldon's approach remains limited by military doctrine that still prioritizes force protection and conventional kinetic operations over patient engagement with enemy populations. The question of verification continues to haunt Gabaldon's story decades after his death. Lieutenant Robert B. Sheik's characterization of him as a relentless self-promoter suggests skepticism about his claims among some who served with him or studied his actions. The nature of his operations, conducted alone at night without witnesses, makes independent verification fundamentally difficult, if not impossible. Yet several factors support the essential truth of his achievements, despite the impossibility of verifying every specific detail. Official military recognition in the form of his Navy Cross citation represents formal acknowledgement of his accomplishments by the United States Marine Corps. Intelligence officer verification provided when 3 Marine intelligence officers publicly confirmed his capture numbers during the 1957 This Is Your Life television program. Contemporary documentation exists in Marine Corps records from 1944 that document the July 8 capture of 807 prisoners. Logical consistency supports the overall narrative since his Japanese language skills are thoroughly documented, as is the historical fact that many Japanese did surrender on Saipan despite intense propaganda against doing so. The exact details of specific operations may be unverifiable, but the overall achievement appears solid when examined against available evidence. Gabaldon's story represents far more than military achievement measured in enemy personnel captured. It demonstrates the power of cultural bridge building in extreme circumstances, where such bridge building seemed impossible. His ability to speak Japanese wasn't merely linguistic competence. It was cultural fluency that allowed him to understand concepts of honor, family obligation, and shame that fundamentally shaped Japanese thinking and behavior. He could speak not just to Japanese soldiers and civilians, but as someone who understood their worldview from the inside, who had absorbed it through years of living within a Japanese-American household. This cultural bridge building emerged directly from his unique background as a Mexican-American youth raised partially in a Japanese-American household. This multicultural experience, far from being a liability or a source of confusion about identity, became his greatest military asset. He could navigate between cultures in ways that traditionally trained military interpreters, no matter how skilled linguistically, simply could not match because they lacked the lived experience of being part of Japanese family life. His story challenges conventional military thinking that prioritizes firepower, technology, and overwhelming force as the primary determinants of military success. In the battle for Saipan, one teenager with language skills and cultural understanding saved more lives than entire battalions with superior weapons and overwhelming firepower. His success strongly suggests that military forces that reflect America's diversity and draw on the cultural knowledge embedded in that diversity possess advantages that extend well beyond traditional metrics of military power, such as weapons technology, troop numbers, or logistical capacity. Guy Gabaldon's legacy extends far beyond his specific wartime achievements on Saipan. He demonstrated that individual initiative, cultural understanding, and moral courage could achieve results that seemed impossible according to conventional military wisdom. His story offers several enduring lessons that remain relevant for military forces and for broader society. First, diversity strengthens military capability in concrete, measurable ways. Gabaldon's Mexican-American background and his Japanese cultural knowledge, acquired through his unique life experience, created operational possibilities that would not have existed otherwise. Modern military forces that genuinely embrace diversity rather than merely tolerating it gain similar advantages in cultural knowledge, language skills, and ability to connect with diverse populations in areas of operation. Second, unconventional approaches can achieve conventional military objectives more effectively than standard methods in certain circumstances. Gabaldon violated military protocol repeatedly by operating alone without authorization, yet he achieved results that conventional operations with overwhelming force could not have matched. Innovation and flexibility in tactical approaches remain crucial in military operations, particularly those involving civilian populations. Third, treating enemies as human beings rather than as targets can create unexpected opportunities for achieving military objectives with minimal casualties. Gabaldon's respectful approach to Japanese soldiers and civilians, his willingness to see them as people rather than as statistics or obstacles, opened possibilities that aggressive tactics would have foreclosed entirely. Fourth, individual courage and initiative can have strategic impact that extends well beyond the immediate tactical situation. One Marine's actions saved approximately 1,500 lives and demonstrated to Japanese populations that American forces could show mercy even in the midst of brutal combat. This demonstration had implications that extended beyond Saipan, potentially influencing Japanese views of Americans throughout the Pacific. While celebrating Gabaldon's remarkable achievements, historical accuracy requires acknowledging the limitations and controversies that surround his story. Some specific claims that he made in later life remain unverified by independent sources and may be impossible to verify. His own accounts, written decades after the events they describe, may contain embellishments or inaccuracies introduced by the natural unreliability of human memory over time. The lack of witnesses to many of his operations makes independent verification difficult or impossible, leaving us dependent on his own testimony for many details. His active self-promotion in later life, including speaking tours and publicity efforts, may have affected his credibility among some historians and veterans. The exact influence of his methods on subsequent military doctrine remains largely undocumented in publicly available sources, making it difficult to trace a direct line from his achievements to specific changes in military policy or training. These limitations don't negate his achievements or diminish their significance, but they serve as a reminder that historical heroes are invariably complex figures whose stories often grow and change in the telling over time. The verified core of Gabaldon's story, supported by his Navy Cross citation, official Marine Corps records, and intelligence officer confirmations, remains genuinely remarkable even stripped of any possible embellishment or exaggeration. The final statistics of the Saipan battle provide the stark context within which Gabaldon's achievements must be understood. Of approximately 30,000 Japanese military personnel on the island, fewer than 1,000 survived the battle. Of approximately 22,000 Japanese civilians present on Saipan, thousands died by suicide, driven by propaganda and fear. American forces suffered over 3,000 killed and 10,000 wounded in the month-long battle. Every single person that Gabaldon convinced to surrender was subtracted from these terrible statistics. His 1,500 captures represent 1,500 people who lived instead of died, who returned to families instead of becoming casualties listed on official reports, who participated in post-war reconstruction instead of becoming names carved on memorials. This human dimension transcends all military metrics and statistical analyses. Behind each capture was an actual human being with a name and a family and a history, someone's son or husband or father or brother or sister or daughter. Behind each civilian saved was a family preserved and kept intact, children who grew up with parents rather than as orphans, communities that retained members rather than seeing them lost to death. The ripple effects of these saved lives have extended through multiple generations. The descendants of people that Gabaldon convinced to surrender now number in the thousands, entire family trees that exist because one Marine chose persuasion over violence on a Pacific island in 1944. After the war concluded, Gabaldon's life took various turns as he struggled to find his place in peacetime society. He worked as a civilian interpreter during the American occupation of Japan, using his language skills in a very different context. He later made the remarkable decision to move to Saipan itself, where he lived for 20 years running a fishing business and maintaining deep connections with the island where he had made his mark on history. His decision to live on Saipan suggests a profound connection to the place and possibly to the people whose lives he had saved. Though specific reunions with individuals he had saved aren't well documented in historical sources, his long residence on the island indicates ongoing engagement with its history and its people, and perhaps a need to process his own wartime experiences in the place where they occurred. In his later years, Gabaldon became an active advocate for Hispanic recognition in American military history, which had often overlooked or minimized Latino contributions to military success. He spoke regularly at schools, veterans events, and community gatherings throughout California and beyond, sharing his story and emphasizing recurring themes of cultural understanding, individual initiative, and the importance of seeing enemies as human beings. His advocacy contributed to broader recognition of Hispanic contributions to American military efforts and helped inspire subsequent generations of Latino youth to see military service as an honorable path. Gabaldon's burial at Arlington National Cemetery represents official recognition of his extraordinary service at the highest level. Arlington maintains strict eligibility requirements, and his interment there confirms military acknowledgement of his contributions to American military success. His grave has become a pilgrimage site for those interested in Hispanic military history and the study of unconventional warfare methods, though it remains far less visited than the graves of more famous military figures. Various organizations have honored Gabaldon's memory in the years since his death. Hispanic veterans groups regularly cite him as a prime example of Latino military excellence and courage. Marine Corps units studying psychological operations and cultural warfare reference his techniques as foundational examples. Military language training programs use his story to illustrate the tactical and strategic value of cultural knowledge alongside linguistic ability. However, unlike some war heroes whose names become household words, Gabaldon has no major memorial dedicated to his memory, no ship named after him, no permanent museum exhibition exploring his life and achievements in detail. His story remains relatively unknown outside military history circles and Latino community organizations. This relative obscurity may reflect lingering discomfort within military institutions about unconventional warfare methods that don't fit standard narratives of military heroism. It may also reflect ongoing skepticism about his achievements among some historians and veterans. Additionally, the Hollywood whitewashing of his story in the 1960 film may have contributed to broader public ignorance of his actual identity and achievements, as many people who encountered his story through that film came away with a completely false impression of who he was and what he did. In an era characterized by asymmetric warfare, cultural conflict, and high civilian casualties in combat zones, Gabaldon's approach offers highly relevant lessons for contemporary military forces. Modern conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and numerous other locations demonstrate repeatedly that military success requires far more than superior firepower and advanced technology. understanding enemy culture, building trust with civilian populations, and providing alternatives to violence remain absolutely crucial to achieving strategic objectives in these complex environments. Contemporary counterinsurgency doctrine now emphasizes many of the principles that Gabaldon demonstrated intuitively 8 decades ago, including the critical importance of language skills, the necessity of cultural knowledge, the value of patient engagement with hostile or fearful populations, and the strategic benefits of treating potential enemies as potential allies. His success on Saipan prefigured modern military thinking about population-centric warfare, where winning the support of civilian populations matters as much as defeating enemy combatants. Yet military institutions still struggle to implement these lessons systematically across their forces. Language training remains limited to small numbers of personnel and often emphasizes rote memorization over cultural understanding. Cultural knowledge training is often superficial, failing to provide the deep immersion in cultural values and social dynamics that made Gabaldon's approach effective. Conventional kinetic operations are still prioritized over patient engagement in most military doctrine and resource allocation. Gabaldon's example suggests possibilities that military organizations have yet to fully realize or implement despite decades of evidence supporting the effectiveness of his approach. Central to Gabaldon's success was his nuanced understanding of Japanese concepts of honor, obligation, and shame. He didn't demand dishonorable surrender that would require complete psychological destruction of those surrendering. Instead, he offered honorable alternatives that allowed Japanese soldiers and civilians to surrender without completely abandoning their dignity or their sense of self. He framed surrender as protecting families rather than abandoning them, as preserving life for future service to Japan rather than accepting defeat, as choosing survival without abandoning core values or identity. This sophisticated understanding of honor allowed Japanese soldiers and civilians to surrender without experiencing the complete psychological breakdown that unconditional surrender would have required. This aspect of his approach deserves special attention because military forces often fundamentally misunderstand enemy concepts of honor, leading to unnecessary casualties and prolonged conflicts. Gabaldon's ability to work within Japanese honor frameworks rather than against them created possibilities for peaceful resolution that conventional military thinking, which often viewed honor as an obstacle to be overcome through force, would have completely missed. His own sense of honor is also noteworthy when considering questions of verification and credibility. Operating alone without witnesses in circumstances where he could have exaggerated his achievements without any possibility of detection, the fact that Marine Corps intelligence officers verified his claims suggests essential honesty in his reporting. Even if specific details may have grown or shifted in later retellings decades after the events, the core of his achievements appears solidly grounded in verified fact. Guy Louis Gabaldon died having saved approximately 1,500 enemy lives through a combination of individual initiative, cultural knowledge, linguistic ability, and physical courage that would have seemed impossible to predict or plan for. His Navy Cross citation stands as official military recognition of extraordinary heroism in combat conditions. His story demonstrates a profound truth that warfare's greatest heroes aren't always those who kill the most enemies, but are sometimes those who save the most lives, who find ways to achieve military objectives while minimizing rather than maximizing casualties. The boy from Boyle Heights who learned Japanese from his adoptive family became a Marine who used that knowledge to prevent massacre on a Pacific island 8,000 miles from home. His transformation from street kid surviving the Depression to war hero saving lives to advocate for recognition of Latino military contributions represents a distinctly American story, one where multicultural background creates unique capabilities, where individual initiative achieves extraordinary results impossible through conventional means, and where a lifetime commitment to sharing lessons learned extends the impact of wartime service across generations. Whatever controversies surround the specific details of his operations, whatever skepticism some historians and veterans express about particular claims, the core truth of Guy Gabaldon's achievement remains solid and verified. He saved more enemy lives through persuasion and cultural understanding than perhaps any other individual American soldier in the entire history of modern warfare. On blood-soaked Saipan, where death seemed the only possible outcome for Japanese soldiers and civilians trapped between American forces and their own propaganda, one small Marine offered an alternative and was believed by enough people to save approximately 1,500 lives. When all the myth-making and controversy and decades of retelling are stripped away, when we focus only on what can be verified through official military records and intelligence officer confirmation, Guy Gabaldon's achievements remain genuinely extraordinary by any reasonable measure. A Mexican-American teenager who learned Japanese from his adoptive family used those skills to save approximately 1,500 enemy lives on Saipan through methods that bore no resemblance to standard military doctrine. Military records unambiguously confirm his mass capture of 807 prisoners on July 8, 1944, in a single day's operations. His Navy Cross citation, approved at the highest levels of the Marine Corps, validates his overall achievements across the entire campaign. These verified facts alone make Gabaldon one of World War II's most unique heroes, someone who succeeded not through conventional military prowess, but through cultural bridge building that saved lives on both sides of the conflict. He wasn't a conventional warrior who dominated enemies through superior strength or killed large numbers of opposing forces. He was a cultural bridge builder who saved enemies from death by offering them alternatives to suicide. He wasn't a powerful fighter who succeeded through physical dominance. He was a small young man who succeeded through understanding and patience and respect. He wasn't a traditional military interpreter who demanded surrender using formal language and military authority. He was a culturally fluent negotiator who offered dignity in defeat and made surrender psychologically possible for people who had been taught it was impossible. His story reminds us that America's strength comes not only from military power and technological superiority, but fundamentally from diversity that creates unexpected capabilities unavailable to more homogeneous societies. A Mexican-American boy, raised partially in a Japanese-American household, could accomplish things that no conventionally trained soldier could have achieved because his unique background gave him tools that conventional military training could never provide. That approximately 1,500 people accepted his offer of life instead of choosing death, despite everything they had been told about American brutality and despite intense pressure from their own military authorities to choose suicide, testifies powerfully to the strength of cultural understanding over violence and propaganda. Guy Gabaldon proved conclusively that in warfare's darkest moments, individual moral choice and cultural knowledge can save lives that seem inevitably lost to violence. His legacy isn't simply the impressive number of captures he achieved, but the demonstration that understanding enemies as human beings rather than as targets creates possibilities that viewing them only as obstacles to be destroyed forecloses entirely. In the brutal arithmetic of warfare, where success is typically measured in enemy casualties inflicted, he chose a different mathematics entirely, one focused on addition of lives saved rather than subtraction of lives taken. This verified legacy, documented in official military records, confirmed by intelligence officers who examined the evidence, recognized with one of the nation's highest decorations for valor, stands as lasting testament to unconventional heroism that achieved extraordinary results through means that violated every standard procedure in the military manual. The exact details of specific operations will likely remain forever unverifiable, given that they occurred alone in darkness more than 8 decades ago. The precise content of conversations that convinced hundreds of people to surrender cannot be reconstructed from available evidence, but the essential truth persists and cannot be reasonably disputed based on available documentation. On Saipan in the summer of 1944, Guy Gabaldon saved more enemy lives through individual initiative and cultural bridge building than perhaps any other American soldier in the entire history of American warfare. That achievement, stripped of all embellishment and mythology and examined purely on the basis of verified military records, remains worthy of the honor, study, and remembrance it has received and continues to receive. The boy from Boyle Heights became a Marine hero not through conventional military prowess measured in enemies killed or territory conquered, but through cultural bridge building that saved approximately 1,500 lives on both sides of warfare's divide. In that verified truth, supported by official documentation and confirmed by military intelligence officers, lies a legacy worth preserving for future generations and lessons worth learning for anyone interested in alternatives to violence, in the power of cultural understanding, and in the extraordinary achievements possible when individual moral courage combines with unique capabilities born from America's diverse and multicultural character.